For years, America's China policy was absolute garbage. Now things are changing. Some people don't want the bad times to end. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. America's decades-long China policy is crumbling, and that's a good thing. Don't think of it as bad crumbling, like a bridge. Think of it like good crumbling, like Parmesan cheese. That's delicious destruction. America's China policy used to be dominated by a policy of engagement, often tied to Henry Kissinger, who continues to this day to push for closer U.S.-China ties. Those ideas reached their climax with President Bill Clinton, who pushed for permanently normalizing trade with China and China's entry into the World Trade Organization. Clinton laid out the core ideology of the Kissinger School of Engagement. By joining the WTO, China is not simply agreeing to import more of our products. It is agreeing to import one of democracy's most cherished values, economic freedom. When individuals have the power not just to dream, but to realize their dreams, they will demand a greater say. Now, more than 20 years later, how has that panned out? China did not become a democracy. If anything, the Chinese Communist Party has become a kind of techno-authoritarian regime, the kind that used to be relegated to dystopian sci-fi movies. Engaging with China has gutted the American manufacturing industry. China has hacked every major corporation in the U.S. Chinese state-sanctioned IP theft has cost the U.S. upwards of $600 billion a year. And China's massive military buildup threatens the security of the entire planet. But hey, Americans got to save some money on poorly made products, so it was worth it all in the end, right? This failure of the U.S. engagement policy is not a secret. According to a recent Gallup poll, a record low of 15% of Americans view China favorably. Not only that, but 66% of Americans view China as a critical threat to the U.S. I'd like this channel to take partial credit for that, but China acting like China is good enough to get those numbers. Congrats, CCP, you deserve it. And the great thing about democracy is that people's views determine how the government acts and what policies it creates. The U.S. is now limiting investments in China and cutting off China's access to chip technology. That's aimed at preventing critical tech from falling into the hands of China's military. And Congress now has a new bipartisan China committee specifically aimed at undoing all the damage caused by years of the engagement policy. Do you know how bad things have to get Congress to agree on anything? They're not even bipartisan on giving dogs treats. Some don't like that the dogs are begging for handouts. So obviously all the people who have been arguing for engagement with the Chinese Communist Party all these years are coming out and saying, yeah, we were wrong. Of course not. They're sticking to their guns and fighting back as hard as they can against any change to their beloved policy of engagement, including calling anyone who doesn't agree with them racist. I'll tell you more after this quick commercial break. Welcome back. People who have spent decades of their life devoted to the policy of engagement with the Chinese Communist Party are seeing their life's work crumble. And they're fighting back. According to China expert Matt Turpin, the explanation put forward by a number of these commentators is that U.S. policy has been hijacked by a tiny cabal of China hawks who are deeply nationalistic and anti-Chinese, and that Washington has fallen victim to groupthink and moral panic. Oh, is groupthink and moral panic what we're now calling it when folks are concerned about, genocide? But what about the bipartisan support for getting tougher on China? Well, actually, according to this opinion piece in the Washington Post, that's a problem. That's right. Bipartisan agreement could mean they are falling prey to a collective delusion. I'm pretty sure that spy balloon was no delusion. I guess we all just imagined that, just like how we all imagined a time when the Washington Post used to have any credibility. This opinion piece laments that the bipartisan China Committee didn't have any of the engagement people there who would have advocated dialogue with Beijing to reduce tensions, which has always worked so well. Not to mention the fact there are so many places where the US and China can work together, like global warming. By work together, do they mean the US begging China to stop being the single biggest contributor to global warming? And China saying, get back to us in 30 years and we'll think about it. So what about issues like the Chinese Communist Party actively killing Americans by pumping the US full of fentanyl? Well, the piece argues that the China Committee's testimony about the threat from China wasn't so much wrong as it was one-sided and misleading. Yeah, it's not wrong, it's just misleadingly correct. I wish that argument worked in court. Objection, Your Honor. All that stone-cold, indisputable proof was completely one-sided. Guess we'll have to call this a mistrial. For example, completely unmentioned were all the benefits of trade with China. So many benefits. Not for Michigan auto workers or the American companies run out of business through China's IP theft, but it's been great for Amazon and owner Jeff Bezos, who also owns the Washington Post, which of course publishes pieces like this. Also, no one pointed out that China has been much more cautious in the conduct of its foreign policy than Russia. So true, Russia invaded a sovereign country. China merely constantly threatens to do the same by constantly sending warplanes near Taiwan. Good point. That's like saying we can totally be friends with the stalker threatening to kill somebody because it's not like they actually did it yet. The author says the real problem is the American people. The problem is that they are prey to hysteria and alarmism that could lead the United States into a needless nuclear war. Witness the unhinged reaction when a Chinese surveillance balloon drifted across the continental United States. Yeah, shooting down a spy balloon that was spying on U.S. military installations after it crossed the entire continental U.S. was so unhinged. Clearly, the American people are just lunatics frothing at the mouth, headed straight for a nuclear war. The author of this piece must be fun to interact with. Excuse me, would you mind wiping down the gym equipment after using it, please? God, why are you being so unhinged right now? I should also point out this piece never once used the words human rights, because human rights really aren't important when there's money on the line. Well, at least money for Jeff Bezos. Now, I'm not saying Bezos had anything to do with this piece, but I do find it interesting that the newspaper he owns chooses to run this kind of opinion piece promoting the engagement school. I am willing to say that Jeff Bezos doesn't care too much about human rights, though, specifically the human right to use the bathroom while at work. Although I guess technically you are allowed to go, you just better have good aim. But this is just the beginning. Wait till you hear what the official position of the New York Times is. I'll get to that right after the break. Welcome back. The U.S. public and government are getting tougher on China, and proponents of engagement with the Chinese Communist Party are fighting back. Here's former U.S. Ambassador to China, Max Bagus, not a fan of the new congressional committee.
The new committee formed in the Congress on China is very anti-China.
No, it's not anti-China. It's anti the Chinese Communist Party. And what the party has done, not just to America, but to the Chinese people, which he later admits in the same interview.
Many in Congress say they want to split the party from the people, implying that maybe there should be an overthrow by the Chinese people of the Communist Party.
Or no, that's not what they're implying. They're just countering the biggest propaganda line of the Communist Party. The CCP wants people to believe that there is no China without the party. The party is the people, which isn't really true. The party is the party. The people are the people. This is the modern Frankenstein is the doctor, not the monster. It's not that confusing. And here's what the people were saying in a recent protest. CCP stepped down. Xi Jinping stepped down. Of course, many of those protesters have now started disappearing. Which reminds me, how are the engagement people dealing with the idea that by opening up, China will become a democracy?
We're not going to change China.
But changing China was the excuse for engagement in the first place. And now you're saying since we can't change China, we have to keep engaging with them? Did China also make these people's brains start disappearing? When it comes to genocide and kidnapping protesters, maybe your reaction shouldn't be the same thing high schoolers write to each other in yearbooks. Never change, CCP. But this is perhaps the most egregious example. Notice, this isn't a regular opinion piece. This is from the New York Times editorial board. That means this is the official position of America's most influential newspaper. It starts out with the basic ideology of the engagement school. For most of the past half-century, the United States sought to reshape China through economic and diplomatic engagement. Wait, reshape China?
We're not going to change China.
Well, get this. It is true that engagement with China has yielded less than its proponents hoped and prophesied. Well, that's the understatement of the year. That's like saying we were hoping for a good return on investment. Instead, we got a cobra spraying venom in our eyeballs. Happens to the best of us. Then they admitted there are problems like the repression of Uyghur Muslims. Repression? You mean torture, forced labor, and what's that word? A genocide. That sentence was so whitewashed, I'm not convinced Tom Sawyer didn't trick them into doing it. In fact, China's brand of state-sponsored capitalism has damaged the health of liberal democracy everywhere. State-sponsored capitalism? You mean communism? Why is that so hard for the New York Times to say? In fact, the word communism or communist is never used once in the whole article. That's right, they don't even say the name of, that one party that has total control of China. What's it called again? Oh, right, the Chinese state-sponsored Capitalist Party. Do they think if they say communism 3 times, communist Beetlejuice will show up and take them to the spooky gulag? But you know what the New York Times does say? The U.S. and China must keep working together on shared problems like climate change, cooperate on addressing climate change, how to slow the pace of climate change. How about slowing the pace of genocide, no? Maybe we should start calling Uyghur Muslims an endangered species. Then will these people start caring about this? The Times says the relationship between the United States and China, for all its problems, continues to deliver substantial economic benefits. Oh, so many economic benefits. I mean, not for Michigan auto workers or the American companies run out of business through China's IP theft, but it's been great for Carlos Slim, the Mexican billionaire who owns the New York Times. I'm sure it's just a coincidence that these billionaires profiting off cooperation with China have newspapers calling for cooperation with China. What are the odds? That wasn't rhetorical. I asked Vegas, and they gave me the odds as 1 to 1. But is China even really a threat? By the standards of superpowers, China remains a homebody. Its foreign engagements, especially outside its immediate surroundings, remain primarily economic. Totally true. Like how China used money to interfere in Canada's elections. That's primarily economic. Or how Chinese banks are now handling almost all narco money in Latin America. Had a whole episode about that earlier this week. The idea that China is minding its own business is so totally wrong. I could devote an entire YouTube channel to it. Oh wait, I do. Remember, the New York Times is the same paper where editors told a reporter who wanted to do a piece on forced organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience in China, the issue was unwelcome at the New York Times. Of course, if we're talking about any other country besides China, the solution is to, of course, bomb the hell out of them. But according to the New York Times, at the end of the day, you know who's really at fault? America. Rather than try to trip the competition, America should focus on figuring out how to run faster. For example, through increased investments in education and basic scientific research. The idea is that America is really just fat and lazy. And rather than trying to improve itself, it wants to kill competition. That is not true. The reality is, the Chinese Communist Party has weaponized its economy to unfairly compete with and destroy the U.S. That's another topic I could do a whole episode about. In fact, I did. It's called Why You Can't Compete with China. I'll put a link below, but here's just one piece of it. China claims to be a developing country. despite being the second largest economy in the world. So it gets tons of benefits like cheap shipping to the U.S. subsidized by U.S. taxpayers. China gets to avoid the same kind of climate change rules that make it hard for U.S. industry to compete, and China uses illegal tactics to outcompete the U.S. in industries like steel and solar panels. This is not a case of America needs to run faster, and investing in basic scientific research won't really do much good when China will just steal the IP. This is like telling a marathon runner to just run faster when the person he's competing against is tied to him on a skateboard and shooting at his feet with a BB gun. Engagement has failed, spectacularly so. This change in U.S.-China policy is not some conspiracy of China hawks or Cold War groupthink. The American people are fed up with it. And a lot of business and media elite resent that their vested interests might be taken away from them because the rabble no longer wants to listen to their good advice. Obviously, some people are very confused about what the best U.S.-China policy is. So let me make it very simple. If you are arguing the same thing as Chinese state-run media, you're doing it wrong. Remember, don't think of it as bad crumbling. Think of it as good crumbling. Delicious, delicious crumbling. And as always, this show would not exist without support from viewers like you on the crowdfunding website Patreon. They're what I call the China Uncensored 50-cent army. And as a thank you to them, I answer their questions at the end of each episode. Today's question comes from Ali Hassan. Hi Chris, so I was reading Confucius's beliefs, and he holds Tian, or heaven, in the highest regard, believing it is benevolent, pretty much aligned with the Abrahamic religion's beliefs. I saw two different versions of Monkey King, and they seem to be waging war on the heavenly kingdom, to fight for liberty, free will, etc. That sounds like Luciferianism. Have they carried off the classical Confucianism in the past few years, and is that what is apparent in their dealings with other nations? Now, that's a very interesting comparison. However, remember, the Monkey King's rebellion was ultimately stopped by the Buddha, and he was cast down and imprisoned under a mountain for 500 years, forced to eat iron pellets when he was hungry and drink molten copper when he was thirsty. After that, he's basically forced into servitude by a monk to aid him in his quest to bring back the Buddhist scriptures to China. The whole story is a metaphor for spiritual cultivation, so it's really not equivalent to the story of Lucifer in Western religions. As for how the CCP uses Chinese culture, it's basically whatever serves the party's interests. Mao launched an anti-Confucius movement when he felt it was a threat to his own personality cult. But when the CCP today wants to infiltrate and undermine other countries, they pretend to care about Chinese culture and create Confucius institutes all over the world. Thanks for your question and your support, Ali. Thank you for watching. Once again, if you want to support China Uncensored, join the China Uncensored 50-cent army over at patreon.com/China Uncensored. All it takes is $1 per episode to keep China Uncensored going. If you want to support the show but can't afford $1 an episode, you can also set a monthly limit. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.